Right, Year 11, I'm going to talk to you today about the impact of World War I on Germany and the Treaty of Versailles. So World War I was between 1914 to 1918 and the people of Germany suffered significantly. The British Navy cut off important supplies to the Germans, and as a result they were missing clothing, medicine and food supplies. So there was a lot of poverty created and hunger as well. In 1915, that saw the start of the protests in Germany, and 500 women turned up outside parliamentary buildings in Germany and started protesting about the effects of the war, and they wanted their men home from the trenches. A year later, that increased to 10,000 workers, and again they rallied round the Germany parliamentary buildings and demanded that the war should end, and down with the government was what they chanted outside the buildings. So what about the impact of World War I itself on the people of Germany? There's quite a few impacts you need to know. First one is food shortages. So the people of Germany lived off turnips, or neeps as we call them in Scotland, and bread due to the blockades carried out by the British Navy. There was a huge flu epidemic in the winter of 1918 which killed off thousands of people. And there was Navy mutinies as well that took place. So the Navy started to refuse the orders of the Kaiser towards the end of the war, and on the 28th of October 1918 the Kaiser ordered the Navy to carry out an attack on British ships, and they said no, and as one ship began to say no to the Kaiser, other ships followed suit, and they decided that the Kaiser was no longer respected and they couldn't follow his orders. And as a result of that, on the 9th of November, the Kaiser secretly fled and ran away because he no longer had the respect and he couldn't get his navy and his army to follow basic orders. The next impact you need to know is that Germany was virtually bankrupt. Now there's a couple of reasons why Germany became virtually bankrupt. One of the reasons was that Germany gave a lot of money to borrow to its allies, but how are they going to make that money back? That was the huge question. So Germany had a cash shortage. There was also the issue, there were 60,000 war widows, so wives without their husbands who had died in the conflict, and there was 2 million children who were left fatherless. And as a result, all that war pensions that had to be provided for that 60,000 women in Germany, where were they going to source the cash for that? So there was a big problem with Germany and its money problem. And the next impact was divisions in society. So the really rich factory owners, they got all their money and wages as normal, but the factory workers, they had to have restrictions to their wages, and this created a big problem between the bosses and the normal workers. There was also a problem with women as well, creating another division in society. During World War I, women obviously took on the role of many men, performing jobs in the factories, working with the shells, for example, and the munitions. As a result, men felt that women had taken time out from raising their children and that family values were no longer important. So this created a source of tension as well. The next thing you need to know about, obviously, is how the political situation in Germany deteriorated as well in World War I. So the problem was, Germany believed that World War I could have been won, and that actually the politicians, they signed away the end of Germany, and these politicians were known as the November criminals, as they signed the scandalous document that led to the fall of Germany in World War I. So again, people weren't happy with these politicians, and the people of Germany felt they couldn't trust these politicians. So you have political instability that has been created as well. Now the most important impact, you could argue, with World War I is of course the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is a separate point in itself, as it's such an important topic for your exam. It comes up every year in some form as a 16 marker or an 8 marker, and that of course is the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles, the biggest impact of World War I, and what you need to know about it is this. So the Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June 1919. The treaty was obviously a punishment that was put onto Germany. The treaty was created and discussed with the French, the British and the Americans. Germany were excluded from the discussions, already making it perhaps a very unfair situation for Germany. So the big three leaders, they dominated the talks. That's France, Britain and America. And the Treaty of Versailles, it put on 4 terms to Germany, 4 very important terms. And the thing to remember with the Treaty of Versailles is the 4 terms is LAM, okay, so L-A-M-B. So what does LAM stand for? So you've got land, army, money and blame. So let's talk about these terms and what they actually mean. So the land term, this is where Germany had All of its overseas colonies were completely taken away from them. It was one aspect of the land that was devastating. It had its Tsar land taken away from it as well. That was the valuable coal resources. And they also lost 13% of their land as well. So devastating cuts to Germany. And of course, you might remember from conflict and tension, is the Rhineland. There was no army presence allowed in the Rhineland, so to give France and Belgium a bit more security. So the next one is obviously the army. So the army, huge cuts. The army was cut down to 100,000 men. They were only allowed 15,000 sailors. And of course, in terms of their equipment, they were not allowed any air force, and they weren't allowed any tanks, and they were only allowed to have 6 battleships. So huge reductions to the army and the navy. The next one is, of course, the money. Now the money, it wasn't actually decided how much money Germany was going to pay at this point in 1919, so don't get confused with that. You need to know it's 1921 when Germany was given the shocker of 6.6 billion marks that they had to pay. So a huge fine, obviously creating huge problems for Germany as well. And then the last one, the most hated term of them all, was the blame. That is Article 231. War guilt clause. Germany had to take 100% responsibility of the blame for World War I. It was the most hated term, they despised it. But as you can see, all 4 terms were a huge significant loss for Germany, and will then go on to create further problems that we will now consider.